So we're actually going to continue our conversation a little bit more on correlation and causation, and in particular get into the idea of causation. Did I freeze or did Dawa freeze?
Because I didn't because and the gender not the color decision, yes.
Dawa, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we're ready.
Should I start talking or?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. I thought, so all right.
Maybe I froze.
Maybe you froze. All right. So I'll say, again, very good to see you all. And we're going to talk more about causation now. And so actually, I'd like to start with asking you your understanding of what causation means in Buddhism.
Judelana, the Shidi Kevala Pentover Sinezilla, Juda, the Pentover Chesadilla Devula was. Shidi Kevala Pentover Chijera, Pendo Sebabujera, Dilla Juda, any Pendo Chesajera, Modilla Devil.
Something that helps something to happen is the factors are the causes. Over here, when we say like when we translate that into Tibetan, we have like cause and the effect or the result. So so the factor is the cause, and what happened is the result.
Beautiful.
The effect, yeah.
So so my understanding is in Buddhism, there's a very rich discussion about cause and effect, and what are the interdependence between different events in the world and reality. What methods does one use in Buddhism to examine causality?
Hello, Tashtile. The tablam di chidang anzo pegi to ni shubaina. Penang anzo shingatab girwa. Shingatab du zambala sabon tangbong la sabon jiktab girwa. Sabon di guiche. Sabon di la tenche ta kochi karsi urta chik nyugu ina karin chiki girwa. Dibu shagorwa. Anan shingi karsi ure me chiktan wa ina de la tenche duwa chik jungurwa. Duwa di debuche ni me di gula shana di gorwa. Pekinzo rikpa tinzo dawchi dogo orda. Peki to ni shuna wa dindira wachi rescue side.
The logics in Buddhism we use.
Dewa di tu sugo re dewa di karsenarwa. Dua yunani karse ure me yoba chikdang dua mena me bati drup jo gorwa.
Ora.
Ta kuni ten temba ta uchi chado ore.
Ora.
Chik yuna yoba ta mena meba.
Alright. In Buddhism, we usually take examples to establish the relationship between the cause and effect. For instance, when we sow some seed in the field, and that is the cause, and the effect is we will see the germinating crops, and that's the result. Also, we take the example of fire and smoke, and if there's a fire, and that is the cause, and then as a result, we see the result of the smoke, and also the relationship between cause and effect. Over here, we think about the interdependency or the dependency between the two variables or the two properties over here, because when we see a smoke, we can infer that there is a fire. If we don't see a smoke, we infer that there's no fire. So the relationship between them is like a dependent nature between the two, like cause and effect.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And very, very, very interesting. Any other thoughts on how to establish causality in Buddhism?
Those Anishanda Yanko Nambinani Masu Jindegi, the Jindi Dubiachwara, Tigi Tela Yanko Tabijanda Mando in the Patinda, yours.
안녕하십니까. 메두 균제라시도 메두 균제니리야 임바디 아주 세마토스는 남제기 슝진날도 세마토스는 세마면도 나 담보디 메다 도니가 마미비스 세마스 사주지 시샤네 텔니가 마미비스 세마스 안티지스 메미비스 세마스 디지스 도미비스 세마스 안냠도 소야게 세마스 아니 그래 메가비스 세마스 안텔라드는 도안가비스 세마스 다든지 아주 무슨도 토네 and the Ombo Tubigi Judan Dindian Talamji dos later.
All right. That Yanagi Inkenas on the survey there. Nachimana Stabala Samala Vana Krogum do. When I said that the Samaga Datanchi or that Samagatan Datan Kashichi Sonsa de Gishi Zambola Chichi Sonda, because he called some of the Buddhist philosophical approaches to establish the cause and effect relationship. Because of my lack of knowledge in Buddhism, I asked one of the Geshe to just briefly translate that into English.
Okay, actually, when we establish a causation, establish some kind of causation between fire and the smoke, there is actually some sort of steps to process, some sort of process to assess. The first is just examining the location where the absence of both the fire and the smoke itself, the location where the absence of the fire and the smoke. Ani shambada karo niga mami bitsema che ani.
Tadijelo memi bitsema roskira metan roag.
Memi bitsema toa memi bitsema imba. And the another one is actually quite opposite to the first assessment, and try to actually see the location where try to see the location where presents the both the fire and the smoke itself. So, ani digital karo. Okay, and then after that is actually once you see the presence of the fire, then we can actually understand the generation of smoke from the fire itself. And then also from that, what we can actually understand is the cessation of the fire causes the cessation of smoke to occur. And mengabada and tuangaba.
Tuayang gadu rada, tuayang gabi semaskiris.
And meduniga gabadra. And then there is a simultaneous cessation of the fire and the smoke that happens some sort of in a chronicle manner or something.
나서 드리지. Robin, you got that?
I got it. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I didn't know you were waiting for me. So that's wonderful. And I would say that many of the methods and logic that were proposed to establish causality that you just proposed are very similar to the methods that we see and use in science. And that's, yeah.
단단다 비전지성이 받단다 메탄 투한가 비체마 대단지어와 어때다 단다 그 방름 시도스 레시자사선로 방름 요죠 단다 되게 그건 로탄데서 아니 지금 생각이 나나 양아 주기 주단 제벽이 그런 저와티 토픽이 지금 로탄다 배 자우도스
and that science is very interested in developing methods like Buddhism to try to establish causality.
그 나치던 처위간에 생각이 많아요. 그게 딱 이번이 바로라야 그 주단 제벽은 저한테 도문도 세긴 저한테 주에 저와 뛰가라야 또 노식 전부 지기요です.
And so what I want to next discuss are some methods that we can use in science to try to dissociate correlation from causality, and I'll make that clearer, but to really try to establish causality.
단다 되게 제라야 아니 차이르 그 타블은 차이르 나네 타블은 가리치 페체 당대 땅아수 가스그레다 야나 디카스 준리사야 대당 딘데세 디가 바로기 쳇벌데 가리 임바딘 제다 아니 지 준리사야 대 칼라로 지라 샤고요 메티 콘데시아긴스.
So in causation is a fairly simple idea, the judgment that one event led to another, but establishing causality is really hard.
다 준리 시스템 발라 나한테 가서 그 디우슈치어 에스레 정말 다 네통게 다 정말치라텐 네수치라텐 네수 젠다 직접 바치고와 되게 퀄렌터트 지나드 코레스 나바나 칼리 카시디카리스나 다 준리긴 저와티 주기야 지나도 치라텐 중고 리서치 거와 어디기 제타데 아야 칼리 카부요레스.
I really liked the ideas that Geshe-la was mentioning of, you know, kind of to establish causality. And I'll be talking about similar methods that we try to use in science.
Now
sometimes establishing causality is quite easy, right? So we can imagine in this situation that the stove is causing the water to heat and causing the boiling of the water. So in some situations, that causal pathway is very straightforward.
다음 살아가 저기 진지게 개체 시험을 담발라야 답되고 쉬워요. 리스트 비선딘다고 지와 다데데 그게 로프데 처우 잡아 텔레텐데 추처우 잡아 당 텔레텐데 당 아니 고가서 그래다 추코야 저거다 추코야 그주데 아니 로프 처우 텔레텐데 정도요. 리스트 데이터 윈바이나 그 진지게 저와디와 저와디 주야라야 리로요. 리스트.
Or I love the example of planting the seeds, that planting the seeds causes, the flowers or the wheat to sprout.
Tatanda ngolaya galagi pijana jenga tsugi ji 70 te batigi pedelaya no to sonsta pe 70 te pigi juti timbala te tigin dibala yana nga tsumi to shado da ani chi karsu judan jutin de chi ma chi ba tin jong res.
But other times establishing causality is more difficult.
Some la yang tsugi junde ge ro ni dewati chi dribi kaps kali khapu yores.
And even though we think there might be a causal association, truly establishing causality can be hard.
Tiga nga suge tiga parotela jitong diu ndawa chita tu samya tinda do chiga sanggo yena yang to ngisro jindi do ngis yoba ti pala ya dubya la ya kali kapu tan yok so yores.
And so this leads to the phrase that we frequently hear in science that correlation does not mean causation or does not imply causation.
Tanda dela tende de ani tsaik na yangsi pechu ta go kusuge chu tsuchi yores ro tsuchom chi yores ti kari la go yores na tunde se tige ani jundu yopa ani ko changyo yo mari la gores.
Just because two variables are associated with each other doesn't mean that we've established causality.
Tandi kari songore se na ngatsula yan jutran ni go paro la ya tunde yopa jutran ni go paro la yan jo yopa samge jutante chiki jutan chiki chenchi yo paro junjing do yo pa ne changyo yo maris.
So this is kind of a silly photograph that I found on the internet.
Tante ane per ko kenza che ane tatone ne sens.
And this word here says correlation and this word here says causality.
Tanga su tsi dusta ba imana gangi tsi de kar lagdo tunde lagdo o de la ya ane ko ge junji sa ti su pe jies.
And this truck is clearly broken down and people are needing to push it to get it to the repair shop.
Tanda ke langkor de ro langkor de imbana dosta thola do che ne ko zochi jasa la ya ane ko bija da chi dogu yo pandi dos pagan thong dos.
Now this person standing on the back of the truck is pushing really hard.
Tanda ko ge te che langkor de na la de ni jalo de ni mi chi wa gang la. And
as the truck moves, so does he. But I think it's safe to say that this person pushing really hard is having no effect on pushing the actual truck down the road.
Langkor ke jalo la ya gana lang de ta ne ko baja shu cham shu tsang do ga baja shu cham bu tang ge yoba te ta ne langkor ten da no la rupa ni ko paro la ya ne jawa chi ga du sa te du khat nga su ge shet ke dus.
Rather, it's these individuals who are actually on the ground pushing the truck that are making the truck to move.
Tong is ya ba na ne sai ga ne tan da de langkor ten baja ta ni kha shi da te chu ge baja ta wala ten de te langkor ten da lo du ge res.
So if we plotted this person's velocity or how fast they're moving and the truck's velocity or how fast the truck is moving, they would be highly correlated with each other. They would be highly related.
Langkor te nyurse ta tanda ge nala yoni ge langkor nala yoni ge ta gangla bajata ni sto de ko ni cha ge nyurse ni cha ge ani te nga su thirila baba imbaina nga su kare thongre se na But neither
of these two people or the person or the truck are causing the other to move. It's actually this other person that's causing the truck to move.
Tiga kapsa chiki chen la tene ta jenda ten kucho tanga yopa nitante mareswa te ngasu langkor ti ngone tana imbanen dalo lang kucho tanga jiga te jabok na ya sai gana de de tamba chatan chitoka kusula tene ten kucho tanga yores.
And that's why we have to be very careful about making causal claims from correlational data. Just because two variables are related do not mean that they're causing each other.
Tanda de kapsa ngasu zarar chigwa kare se stambala ya tunde gin joy yopa chila tene de ta ni jundi ge ranje dabya chigorwa te kapsa zabza shu chi gu yores tanda dinda do ge nitan kapsa ngasu ge tunde ge ranje shu chambu chi thona thong yore tunde ge ranje te shu chambu thong yoba imba na ya deni ge parola ya jundi ge dawa me pate ya ni gu yores.
So let's look at some real life data and kind of make this point. So this is a figure that I showed you earlier. You'll recall that this is a scatter plot in which this researcher looked at activation in the brain's reward circuit, which we learned about in the other day as the ventral striatum. And then plotted those values on the x-axis that we learned now is the horizontal axis at the bottom of the figure. Higher values here are associated with higher activation in the ventral striatum. The researcher also plotted people's self-reported psychological well-being. We now know that this is the vertical axis or the y-axis. The researcher finds a positive association such that as a person has higher ventral striatal activation, they also tend to have higher psychological well-being. The researcher also shows the correlation coefficient, which numerically depicts the strength of this relationship. This coefficient or R value does not reflect frequency, but the strength of the association between these two variables. And this is a moderately strong association, 0.45. So we have ourselves a very nice correlation, which is that high activation in the brain's reward circuit is associated with high psychological well-being.
Lepinana Kandastigor said, Tig Malana ya, Chonwigi, Jellich or Teta, and Susugi Dichigi, Tsechigorata, but then Chago Parolaya, and it's Timbig Doyo Patsunis.
But we have not established causality.
That Tunde, but Tunde, you but some Matopi, couldn't you parla jet and Jiva Tripa, Tangio Maris.
We don't know if high ventral striatal activation generates high psychological well-being, or if high psychological well-being generates high ventral striatal activation.
Tandade kasanga so kare ha ku yo mare senarwa dunchi hanshung na la ya ku jego tishu chenbu yo pa na dishi je gi cheji tishu chenbu de la tende de ta dishi gi cheji tishu chenbu zheng yo pa da yang na dichigi karsugre da chi rimbati tuwa yo pa tila tene de tang dinchil hanshin gna la jegu rimbati shu chambu pege yo pa gangchi imbati nga sugi tenket kyo mares.
To establish causality, we would need to do an experiment.
Ta dig parola ya jundrig drewa zuek chet nga su takshe chi dug ngres.
Where we somehow manipulate these variables and assess whether manipulating or modifying one of these variables leads to changes in the other variable.
Ta tanda dig parola ya jundrig drewa zuya la ya nga su karichi go resena de la takshe dug ngres. Ta takshe depi kapse digin jutang kanron chi la yan jor tang go res jutang kanron chi la jiro tang de tang jiro tang tila tende de tang jutang jenda de la yan jor du du tel ta go res.
So the heart of experimentation involves the manipulation or the modification of one variable to determine its effects on another variable.
That is tambala ya takshe simji chiwi kaps ani ko nang ki tukcha ma sone ke chembuchi kar res tambala ya ni jutang kanron chi la ya jiro tang tila tende de tang ani jutang shenda tila ya jiro theg du mundu sa te takshe che de ani ko takshe ge nang ge da chu ko neto ma sone ke chembuchi res.
So that's what's required for establishing causality.
Ta tinga su jutang drewe ge drewa tsia la ya ta de de go yo res.
So let me give you an example of a possible experiment.
Ta de la ya nga su gen jong se pe ge takshe chi ko mo tre chi yes.
And this is a project that I'm working on with Geshe Lobsang.
Tan de gare da na gislodon la nyam te ane ko kasa dripshin be ge leche chi yes.
Now, Geshe Lobsang developed a compassion training program that can be administered to people with little prior exposure to meditation.
Tanda gislodon la ge tanda ane gomdre ninji ge gomdre tena do chi ko ge ta ko ge dripsha yores rezosha yores ta de gare gomdre de gare res na ngoma chi gomdre gi nyamnyo chi ga mechu imba na kusula ya chi de drip chwa ge.
And this program is 10 weeks in duration. And involves 3 ingredients or 3 components. The first component are foundational practices, which are designed to help people stabilize their mind.
Ta ko tupcha thampote kar resena manji ko gomde teres manji ko gomde de kasu su kar chi resena anin jushi chi ko chola ya chi sambati chi samti tembu yo agi cheto mu tuju res thampote.
The second involves cognitive exercises based on the analytic techniques of your tradition.
De nginjin jongder sa de so de ani nampe gi chizu ge jong na la ya nga chu jegum yo ro jegum gi shi sha de ta zuju chi res.
And the third involves cultivating loving kindness, or Dawa. You corrected me last time. Sewa, is that the right phrase? Loving kindness or warm-heartedness?
Yeah, sewa o chamse, yes.
Yeah. So the third component involves cultivating sewa, loving kindness.
Ta tandage tigo tupcha sambati kala na dele chamse chindo ta nga so sewa se te ane kandas chegu yo se te ge ani nyamna res.
Now, in addition to having people do the training program, we're also collecting some other variables or outcome variables.
Ta tanda mi kosola ya ani gomdre ge nyamlen chi bi gan la ya nga so jenda kare chore se na kosola ne chi ya draw jechip ge draw tin da ya pures.
So we're collecting some data on people's moods, and in particular their sadness or their scores of depression.
That's the culture na kuso ge chi sam kham tang de yo chu ge ne tanga te dro chi ag chi to chi rest picha sha pa ne sam khang ge na ne ane chi chu a sam ba chu a tang yang na depression yim pa chi ro wa de da ke ane che de je la ya chu tang yo res.
And we're also going to be collecting some blood on participants to measure their levels of inflammation.
아니 현대의 단단 주시진이 주시진큰 고수는 차트도 슬랜데 차그나네 아니 가리 타이어 시스템 바쿠수가 인플레메이션스가 냥카타나 마키상스가 냥칸데 가라로치 정도 세테 체제시도 차용래요레스.
Now, inflammation is associated with the production of molecules that help the body heal from wounds or fight off viruses and bacteria.
또 단다게 디커스 냥카사데 강기탄 조요레 시스템 발라야 가수가 주포나텔 마칸다우치 총바인바이나 티양체 수야당와 니센다 양치가 가서버다 심부탄 년신도게 지가 양 나선도 총바나 틸라파 지 타비아치가로 파 고야치가로 어디탄도요레스.
While inflammation is highly adaptive in the short term, when it's chronic, it's associated with a lot of health problems.
다 집중이 많아 가지고 냥카사데 지 판순 주초초다 요레스 임바나 양코 가서버다 주랑부지라 양 가지고 냥카데 대바임바나 아니 zupola 지 뇌비기 아니 지 주랑부가 나사된다 제그레스.
And these include allergies and heart problems and diabetes, as well as others.
다다는 리카스 가지고 냥카사데 값이 많아로 아니 mambochilaya kundo yore tinane ta so ta de la pisha baina ji allergy system bala mitre pas bora ta mitre pa ta ne nyangna cha ne shenda chining sa ko de to to yures.
So our theory needs to guide our hypothesis.
Ta di kapsang asula namsha chigora ngasuga namsha tege karichi gu yore sana 아니 가지고 최샤텔라야고 람튼도 지구요레스 아니도 최구요레스.
In our theory is that compassion training would help make people feel better, and that making people feel better would have a positive effect on their health.
단단하게 남서대 카레스 스tambalaya 단단하게 인지가 검뷰티 제바 임바이나 밀라야 초와 야굴 해게 주바던 초와 야굴 해 받딜라 했는데 미기 트로텐라 팽게요 바디 아니 남서 최저들레스.
So that's the model, that's the theory.
단티 카레스 스tambalaya 남샤 타야나 비즈들레스.
But in science we want to translate that theory into a hypothesis.
다 tsering 나네 가서 가르치 고레스나 남샤 때때가 저 최저치라 파줄고요레스.
And you may recall that a hypothesis is a very specific prediction about the results of our experiment.
사실 저 텐수고요지레스 단다 최저사야디 값이 많은 최저사야디가라나 저 남자치기 아니 지가 다 믹든 마소나 셰타바치라야 콜라톤베게 아니 그 초바치기 맞대 최저 텐수고지레스.
So in developing a hypothesis, you need to get very specific about your prediction, and that prediction needs to be very precise to your methods that you're using in your experiment.
단단데 가서 최저샤비 값이 많아 저런게 지금 가서 그러다 지금 제바지야 대배 데이터 가서 그래 니튼 속으로 왔다 체트 주바드네로 연구를 때문에 니 저런 게 드베티양 가서 그래 지금 믹싱 이젠트나 연구요레스.
And so a hypothesis here could be that the compassion training that Geshe Lobsang developed will decrease inflammation and decrease people's depression or sadness.
단단데 가서 단단데 검도 데이터 디슬라그 tamsichugo gombre de la ya shimji chiage kusu cheshate kare insana anyanji gombre cheba yemna nyenka chinyon dugre tinanshin yimu tang tandanga samba chua chigorwa ote tang ane teta ke nebapti chinyon la dugre se de cheshate yens.
Now you'll recall that the philosopher Karl Popper said that a critical component of a good hypothesis is that it's falsifiable, which means that you can prove it false.
다시 그 시신의 담바 속에 지레스와다 데 가서 따트마와 칼퍼프 가리송요레세나 체르키 딱셰치기와 체르키 딱셰치기 고트체 케치시치가레세스 담발라야 데 남샤데 아니 초아드롱 인구그레스 지레스.
And so I'd say that this hypothesis passed the test.
다 담바게 저샤데 바이나 고 초아드롱 세테게 아니 고 가서 데게 자신데 참고도스.
because we can measure inflammation and we can measure depression and determine whether this compassion training program alters either or both of those variables.
단단히 가서 가서 가르치듯 그래서나 년카기 세팅 가서 체인지 거래 디난싱게 이목기 세팅 체인지 그 레스틴스 담발아야 니지 민지 검도 지와텔라 텐데데 아니 년카다 예목이 차 지 뇽두고데 마두고도 뇽두고돔도 아니 야나 지금 야 년지 검들라 텐데데 야나 년카치부도 야나 지 이목치부도 지뇽두돔도 사치거라 되게 너한테가 속에 체인지를 다시 짓고요 레스.
So could somebody just tell us how they would develop an experiment to test this hypothesis?
다양한 수들의 최샤치도가 최샤 대 다시 지역이 제때 아니 가지고 다시 전고지 지부여로 다시 전고대 간다로 지지사레스 아니 제수나네 델라 렌선이오나 선로지다스.
네네. 그 방법.
단다 소샤데 따지 제치도 루카니 거여와
네네.
찍라 곰 겹추 아니 루카 찍들라 곰 맞춰와체 코란 다가란샤 데네 루카니가 타코 니모레레 신도 톨렌제 저 딜링게토네 톨렌바이나리 다가나신 단다디 차따지 제야다 코란기 다 가사 단 이지 토네 파기 레베 테리 따지 제야데 딘제기 쯤베 따지 톨렌베 토네 아니 타마델라 두르치네 아니 도스 제서레스
We can have two groups, one do meditation and one doesn't, and then we can have multiple ways of measuring it. For instance, first is self-reported questionnaires that we can ask them, and the second we can check the blood that you have mentioned. Also, we can use EEG to see their brain activities. So, with all this method, we can have an idea if we can have this experiment design.
Perfect. So with that, let's look at some of the terms. Now we've introduced some of these terms already. We're going to introduce them again here in the context of this example. So that is a perfect study. As was mentioned, we could have two groups. We could have some people who do the compassion training, and then we could have others who don't do the compassion training.
Tadande lempe aposon sonsra detan dene tanga su tashi de dribi caps tandoyo juge ani tsu anenga chenji tsikashi ji ani deshijagi insta tandade caps chizu de shishaban bana su rukani la ju do rukani la su ne rukashi ki gomja ba ta ruka chenda de gomaja diores.
So this would be what's referred to as the independent variable.
Tadande caps
So what we're manipulating here experimentally is whether or not a participant is assigned to the compassion training or not assigned to the compassion training. And that is a perfect example of an independent variable.
Now you
can have different levels of an independent variable. So in our current example, we have two levels. We have you're doing the compassion training or you're not.
So
But let's say we're not just interested in whether or not compassion training is better than not doing any training. Let's say we're also interested in comparing compassion training versus mindfulness.
jamtan inji ko gomde chiwa te nga su tang injung gomba se kora ta lu si chigla dream big gomchi ja chigorwa ti ta yang ko yang chepar karin du chung du se te ta te na yongres.
And so in that example, we would have 3 levels. We would have a compassion training, we would have a mindfulness group, and then we would have a comparison group who is not doing any training.
Tanda de kapsin bana nga so chi tume gen jutang de la yarwa tume jutang de la ma manda smi yores chi kala ne cham nying ji gom ji che shende de tang yin zong gom ji cherwa chi lu chi la dume gom ya chi gorwa te che ane samba de gom chone me jala smi yores.
Or we could have 4 groups. We could have compassion training, mindfulness, exercise, and a comparison group.
Ya shende kari yona de gesa nga so din sin tin de yona de ko res chi chamnyangji gomji chi shenda te tang inzong gomji chi shenda chi nga chu ljun chi ni chi che din chen che ne sam shiba de la ya ne ku chu changma dursa ge ya ko din chen chi che din chen shi le yo pa chi na de gres.
But for our example, let's just have 2 levels and we'll just do compassion training versus a comparison group.
Na hata da de kapsa nga chu la din chen yo pa chi chi ninji gomji chi ta chi ninji gomji ti je dursa ge din chen chi ten cha pe shu tang ge yes.
So now the dependent variable is the outcome measure or measures that we're examining.
Na tande tuichi jutang sa de kar re se stambala ya tang asu gin jutang na ne che ja choro che ja de tamagi jumdi ti kap se che ja ge ne ta choro wa tela ku.
And it's not just psychological well-being or health. We have to very precisely define the measures and the method that we're using to establish our dependent variable.
Hata da nga su ge karsa tuichi gin jutang ti ni chi tang ke bi kap se nga su ge karsa greta samlu na tali tang wi gi kas ta din thang de ro chi do phang do mu se ti sa mai ba ane nga su ge ti tak chen je gi che tro ti tak chen je gi che te kare kare chi re do se ti ane ngon su to bu ga ne ko mukse ngi jin ga ne ko this desi ja gu yores.
And so for our example, let's have 2 dependent variables. One is self-reported psychological mood or sadness, depression, basically a measure of sadness and depression.
Tan de ka singa sula ya ane tuichi gen jutang te ni yo pala chasha ge instambo te ane susu ge greng mo ne ge ane nyen tu tun sha ju chwa zo de ane susu ge samkan tang de yo chu ge de ka sin ba na ane nga su ge yes chu wa tang yang na yimu ge number te tang de yo chu ge susu mo ne pa nyen tu tang sha ju te chi ches.
And the other is a variable we'll extract from the blood that tells us how much inflammation a person has.
Ta niba te kare jutang jamba te kare ta ge ins stambala ya me tan jishi chini te ge chak na ne ane tha lenche chak na ne ne ko nyen kha tan de wi gi chitang thu te ka su chindu te ta ge ins.
Now, when we think about doing a research study, we want to give some thought to our control condition or our comparison condition.
Ta tanda de ka sem ba na nga su ge ta se de pi ka su nga su kare samna tang go re se na ane ka su ge nga su chunjing ge ne tang tang yang na chunjing ge ne ba chi go ra chunjing ge ne ba yang na nga su ge din sem ba ne dursa ge din sem to ga o te samna tang go yo res.
And the control condition is very important, or this sometimes is referred to as the comparison condition. Because this establishes the baseline for measuring the effect of your independent variable.
Ta de karsa de ke chambuchi chago res nga chu chonjung ge ne tang to chonjung ge ne bab de chan sama nga chu chonjung ge ne tang se gre chan sama nga chu ge de karsa gre se na dursa ge rukhas ge do ga de ke chambu chago res ta de kar chi go res na chon ga takshi shimji chi wa te thama de la ya dursa ge jin jin san ro chi la pe chu tang go res ta de ge kala na ne chorang ge ji thomi ge damya ge nga chu de yo wa 두메긴 주장치로 두메긴 주장티 담비 값을티 펜토포 도문도 세티 아니 첨바치그레스.
Now, our current control condition is somebody who just doesn't do any of the training, and we basically just get the same measurements on them, but they don't do any training.
그 단단히 값을 단단하게 특색되게 나라야 가지고 전승계 내밥디 가리레서나 네 지금 가서 검지가 자니시로 검자가 면역이 됐는데스.
But an alternative would be to have a control group where maybe they do a relaxation training or other types of things that establishes kind of a more representative baseline as opposed to just not doing anything. Now, another very important concept in doing experimentation is what's called randomization. Because you want to randomly assign participants to either the experimental groups or to the control condition.
And
the goal of randomization is to reduce the likelihood that some other factor, sometimes what we refer to as a confound, is explaining your results. So we would want to make sure that we have an equal number of men or women or people of different ages or different meditation experience in the different groups in order to make sure that we're not getting artificial effects. So you could randomly assign people, and randomly assign people would be like flipping a coin to say whether they're in group A or group B. That's one way to do it. The alternative is you could say, you know, we're not going to randomly assign people. And for example, we're only going to recruit people into the study who have no experience with compassion training. And neither of these decisions are good or bad. It all depends on what the goals are of your particular study. So a lot of what we do as researchers is think of the best way to define our very specific study, knowing that we can't address everything in one study. We do our best to do the best study we can, and then we do additional studies on top of that to add to the amount of information we can collect over time.
tampo tashi shinji chigi detan kuga netun chigi ratu chiongurwa otila tene detan ya tashi shinji jenda tene detan tegala ya netun tang chigi shishe tene ya ko kanun chiya netan tene yongwa res.
Now, the last concept I'll touch base on before we move on to something new is a very important concept in establishing causality.
자 단다 아니 현대 친구들 마치고라 양아 수텔라 타마게 내던 친구들 지금 스티컬라나 내가 수가서 그러다 준지기 내던데와 준지기 내던디 더베게 체도 아니 개침부 임비기 스치도 안데시자기스.
You'll recall that my theory said that compassion training lowered people's depression or increased their mood, and that in turn helped them have better health and in particular lower inflammation.
다다데 최초 장거 반에 gelage takshete gi namshana ne samdang bai mana ninji gomdla tenedete ani karchigresana migi ninji gomdre chwala tenedete ngachuge samge samkhamgi ta chuata yemgti sete jinyong la chinji jinyo chila tila tenedete ani nyenka nyong drugre sege nitate chechuge peche tokuyo chires.
So more precisely, what I'm saying is that compassion training has a positive effect on people's mood and lowers their depression. And it's that lowering of depression that in turn results in a reduction of inflammation. So I've created kind of a causal chain here by which compassion training lowers sadness, and it's the reduction in sadness that reduces inflammation.
tanda de netande kasim bana nga chu junde gi rewa tiang ko ge chi mai ba chwa do ji ro to ba khashi yo pa chi dus de la tensa yo sta karis go re sana nga chu ge nyang ji gomre chi ba la tende de ta mi gi samkhan la pengre se wa samkhan te ya go cha la pengre ti phem ba la tende de ta ani nga chu ge chi chwa ta yim ke netante ma nyong do go res chwa ta yim ge netante ma ro ba la tende de 아니 가서게 지금 보나들이 년카게 내던데 용도 그래서 그래서 내가 지금 반응 가서라 지금 준대게 저한테 양고 지금 많이 봐 지금 림바트마 가는 디스트리뷰어스.
My initial method did not allow me to test this particular type of causality.
다 단다 담보텔라야 그 사실 담보텔 트리픽스 단다 델라야 가서 가서 그러다 특히 담보텔 값이 바이나 데랑아 속에 디치고로가 준지기 드비아기 다시치고라 데도 스타타치기 마송스.
Because I simply tested whether or not compassion training affected depression and inflammation in the same assessment.
다 담보대 만에 gelay takse 담보대 드비 값에 아니 검 연질한테 데이터 좋았다 이먹다 아니 년가와 진용 땅도 무두세테 takse 치근안에도 통고도 무대 봐인스.
If we want to establish causality in the model that I've developed here, we need to introduce ourselves to the idea of mediation.
다 단다데 값으로와 디그 값은 아주게 디나도게 지금 준비가 나와도 주고요 바는 디 값은 아주게 지금 반등게 샤와다나 참조게 샤와서 지금 두스 모토치고 두스.
So a mediator here means that one particular variable, like sadness, accounts for the relationship between two other variables, for example, compassion training and inflammation.
단단되게 가지고 참 좋은 컨셉이 가르쳐 거래서나 단디 값인 바나로 단다 비천디 값인 바나 참 좋은 컨셉 단다 좋았다 이건 로체 참 좋은 컨셉이 가르니 이거 바로 참 좋고 요래서나 냥지고 검든다 아니 년칸 이거 바로 라야 참 좋지 요래서.
Oh, good to see you. This is Nicole's daughter. Is it Sylvia, Nicole? Or?
Can you introduce?
No, what's your name?
I'm Zoe.
Zoe. Why did I say Sylvia? Can you say hi to everyone, Zoe? Oh, good to see you. Zoe, you want to learn a little bit about mediation? We'll see. We'll see if I can entertain you. Okay, so what we're really saying here is that sadness is the mechanism by which compassion is having an effect on inflammation. And a point that I want to make here is that if we really wanted to test this model, it wouldn't work to just have a pre and post measure of compassion and inflammation in blood. We would need to collect data over time. And we may need to collect multiple data points over, say, months in order to establish whether changes in depression as a result of the compassion training drove changes in inflammation. So while our initial method of just looking at compassion, the effect of compassion training on sadness and depression would allow us to establish causality, that this training program affected people's sadness and depression.
Now, can you repeat that again, sorry?
Yeah, so while our initial method of examining the effect of compassion training on sadness and depression could establish causality, that compassion training affected both sadness and depression.
아니 건드 인지 건드 지와텔 테네 지와다 이무다 야나 디냥카티 뇽르고 세테 도시치 값에 지치는 가속에 벌써 당부들라 아니 냥지 건드 타 아니 지와다 이무 뇽도 돼야 지거로다 냥지 건드 지네 지와다 이무디 뇽 두고도 세테가 바로게 아니 준리기 되와디 그레스.
To test the hypothesis that changes in sadness or depression led to changes in inflammation, we would need to collect data over longer periods of time to be able to establish this chain of causality. So this gives you a little bit of a window into how we think about causality in science. And Nicole, do you want to take it from here? Or? Okay.
Great. Let's see here.
And just to let everyone know, I need to leave about 20 minutes earlier today because I have to go meet my new nephew.
Congratulations, Robin.
My sister had a baby.
This communications canatele and this tongo dos right ne kogi pinjaro pomola and those purichi record the tuado insa then Robin.
So right now we are going to talk a bit about sort of your research projects or sort of our research projects and how we would start to look at those data, visualize those data, and make some sense of the data that you'll be collecting, mainly in surveys. And so to do this, what I want to first do is sort of go back to the pretend study that Robin and David and Ken and I created.
ni tanda chezu ge da nga su nyamshi che tang chezu dinsen ge nyamshi che tinda yorwa tiga kaps ani tangthu mangpu chi ra yorwa ta tangthu mangpu chi ra ba de ani kandas peche tang de ta ko kwa de kandas langu yore se ti ko la ya ani desidus jia insra ani ti kaps ani dila ya nga su jenda kar ta gen se ne khesa ani chi ya takshe ge chi kar sa tangthu dur chi ya ju zo song dila chi ta chi de se ja gens.
So the experiment that what we decided to test is to ask whether does walking meditation in the evening increase sleep quality.
Tanga su takshe chia de la ya chi twa kari to ya chestang yore sena ani gonda ro gomo gondro de ani rugam ti jaba imba na ani ki chi pikasa ma ani yao khwa de la ya chi yao dum du sa to ti ga la takshe chi yores.
So for our pretend experiment, we collected data on 6 people, 3 who meditated and 3 who did not.
Da de che de ro nga su ta se te ga la ya mi tu ga la ya dus ta se gi ti gi ani tang tu te de chi yes te ti na ne ka la na mi sum ge ta se che ba che mi sum ge ta se ma kar sa gom ri chi wa ta mi sum ge gom ri chi yo ma des.
And this one's me.
Te ge la yes.
Okay, so what we now need to start to think about is what are the specific questions that we can test. And go ahead.
Nasu samlu kar tang gor sana ro ta tanda ge takshe ta nasu ge jwa mixi ge jwa ni jen ro ani kari chi takshe chi tkun du mu du te jwa te ta ge chim cha goris.
And put that in the context of independent and dependent variables.
Ta ti ge jwa te ani ga su ge chi te che tang tu me ge ji trang sa te ge number gang la pha sha gu yoris.
So our most important independent variable is meditating or not meditating.
Ta tanda ti kap sang chu tu me ge ji tang ke chi shi de kar ji chi ke chi shi de kar es na gom ja ba ta gom ma ja ba ge tin sin yo ro te res.
To think about the dependent variables, we need to think about what survey questions we asked for this pretend study.
Ta de kap sa tu chi ge ji tang te la sam tang ni ba na de kap sa nga so ge ta se shin ji ti kap sa mi la ya jwa chi ya ge chi tu so chi yo ro ti jwa kar kar ta men se te ga sam tang go yo res.
So for our pretend study, we had everybody wake up in the morning, grab their phone, and do a short survey after they woke up.
Nga so ta se de kap sa kar che che re se na ro ji chi ni cha ma ge shop pa nga wa ni le se pa ta ane su su kha par lang de ta jwa te ta la len je chi yo res.
And each person did this for 3 days.
Ta mi re re ngone ba na ni ma sum la dus len ja yo res.
Oops. Okay. So now, one of the survey questions we asked was, how long did you sleep last night?
Ta tanda nga su ge so te na ne jwa ta ge jwa chi kar la na dang go jun rong lo la ni queen se jwa te res.
So our one specific question is, do those who did meditation sleep longer at night than those who did not?
Ta tanda de ka sa nga su ge mus ka ge jwa tri ni jwa te kar la na ro gom jani chu ro ru gom jani te gom ma jan ni le ani jun rong ba ni khu du mu du se te res.
So with this question, our dependent variable is their reported length of sleep at night.
Ta tanda de ka sa nga su tu chi ge ju tang de kar re se na ani ko su gonda ni ku ka su ni ti jun rong lo la ku sha sa chu ro o te res.
So it's sort of how long they slept, and often we are, in this case, reporting that in hours.
Ta de ka sa ju ni ti jun rong lo la ku sha sa ti ro ti chu ge na te chom bi chi ro.
So we have our 6 participants. And in blue are those that meditated, and in red, they did not. And the first one, who's Robin, slept 7 hours one night, 7 hours another night, and 5 hours the third night. David, who's a very good sleeper, slept 8 hours each night.
And
David is taking his final exams, so this is definitely fake data because I know he's not sleeping well.
David
and then we collected 3 nights of data from Ken. I did not meditate. So, and those are my 3 hours. Geshe Daldu slept 7 hours each night. And Dawa keeps getting woken up by his baby, so he's not getting very much sleep. So now what we want to do is our question is really sort of the data of those who meditated, are they sleeping longer on average than those who did not? And sometimes for average, we use the word mean as well. So for an average, we want to think about all of the observations we have, and report in some way sort of what is the middle observation. And the way we do this is we take all of the data from our meditators and we add those numbers together. Right, so this is all of these numbers. And we're going to divide this whole thing by the number of observations, which is 9. We collected 9 data points. So it's our total divided by the number of observations. And in this case, for the data that I just showed you, we get an average hours of 7 hours of sleep for the meditators. And for those who did not meditate, we get 6.8 hours. Now, we may talk later in this workshop about sort of thinking about variation and sample size. But overall, when we think about these 2 averages, while one is a little bit higher than the other, that's probably not a biologically meaningful difference.
That under the teaching us to collect the Shajam Grace or Chikarlana, Chapel Cario Pateta, and in Atsugi, the Shichini, synthesizes Nambalaya, Pizze, Tegi, Chichung, Sechin the Shajagora, or the Deshe Jagres, the Jila and the Shajagin, Standard de Casumbana, Chanela Taba and Banashu, Shuchita, this is the cover to us, named by Nayanko, that you income good tennis shape by Nayanko, Chapashida Midus.
So I would like to ask somebody to come up with an idea of what kind of graph we might use to show these two averages so that somebody could compare them.
Hello.
Hello.
Good morning. I think it's the best use for bar graph.
And why a bar graph?
Because it's two group and then it's I think the y-axis we can put the average and then x-axis and we put this two group. Then we can see it very clearly.
Yep.
Which group that get the much bigger amount of sleep.
That's all. The thing also carpet against and a person nurse at the patient against the Jensen Carcinella by Bananga go the Carsa, Gomjani Majiniga Dinseni or was Dinseni any and also Carsa Teti Galaya, Dinsen Gomjani Tamajiniga Dinsen Chasha, any Jean Tigalaya, any Chanyum Ganikuya, which 30 Shaba in Bina, and also remote in Narigala Chiba in Bina, and then also Masuto on it, well, a little dose.
So we could do something like this, which I think is a great idea, where we would see sort of the average for those that meditated here and the average for those that did not meditate here.
That did also narrated by a quote Soyala Yatatu to start the deck of Simban also Dinsen Cherwa, and the Chanyum Stokatsu Jenny Kushas at the Gonjapa Gomajapagi, Dinsen Chagi Chanyongi, Nikubi Setidus, Piridigala, and Naridigala 10 years.
So let's look at one more sort of example of data that we collected in our fake study. So another question that we all answered in the morning was, do you remember dreaming last night?
Digging on it to a shin that you some Carita or Senara, Nichiran Dangon, Senacon, Namalam Tang, what the Tango say to the trio.
So for this question, people are not going to report a number. They're going to report either yes or no.
Changachi think about it, and a Lanka Jaggers and a Tangson Tamason say Landy Jaggers.
So we can imagine that Robin remembers dreaming every night.
Robin like on the topper and you learn about the tensus.
David only remembered when he woke up, remembered having dreamt one of the 3 nights.
David like Nima Sungan on the Shama Sungan and Shama Chile and Milan about the tensus.
And Ken remembered 2 nights.
Nahane can like Shama Nila Yamlan about the tensus.
And then we have data for everybody else. So here, the dependent variable is remembering whether you dreamt or not.
And
I'm going to just erase this so we have more room. And so here, what we would do is this is the data for the meditators. We can add up the yeses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
And then
the no's are 3. And at this point, we can think about the proportion that are yes.
The proportions in the
So for this, it would be the number of yeses over the total number of observations. Which would be 6 over 6 plus 3. Which equals 0.67. So this is the proportion. If we multiply it times 100, we get 67%. The percent. So thinking about these kind of proportion data, what's one kind of graph that we could use to show these data?
Jacha Pabcha Jugitan Duch de and the Chomber Jiala Yang Atsugi, Kiriga, Yokashikashi, Tinani Kangi Pechatangi base.
Pie chart.
That's all.
Was that a pie chart?
Yes, pie chart.
Yeah, so for that, we know we could do, we can imagine 2 charts, one for the meditators.
Pie chart Pechitangi Sonsa, Gorrit Pechitangi Sasa, the Kapsimbana, Gorri Nietzsche, any Gorris Chiti, Solaris, and a Gomjanichi Chiti, any Chendati Gomjanilaris.
And let's see, it was 67% yes. So it's going to look something like this were the yeses.
And then Tandadin and the Jaja to Children, then Kalana, I'm not trying to say this.
And then for our no meditation group, the data that I showed you, we had many fewer yeses.
That under Gomjan, Gomajin, you get into television by Bana, Chigaman, but the tank to say, take it has on your shas.
Now, there are many different ways to show proportion data.
That under the Kasanga to search to go, which Haki Katsuchi, Singudu said, it's Chayala, Chayag Tablam among boyers.
And there's many different ways to show averages.
Chanyum ge a tongue to the Chamber Chivala, Tablam Hachamamboyers.
And we'll sort of go through, hopefully to the point where with some of your data, you'll be able to try sort of different methods to visualize your data.
망포 트르기 탑란 망포지가 담다 배치당 됐던 선배치 태야기네 당들라고 갈래 지지는 것도 지용 그랬어.
But I want to sort of use our remaining time to just show you how your data is going to get imported into a spreadsheet and how we might figure out one of these measures using the Google spreadsheets.
다다다 사주 되게 나라야 가지고 지제시부게 저한테 당바이나 저한테 라텐데 당투지 라주 주어와 당투 라바테 아니 가지고 당투 리무그나틀레 간다스 총코리 랭구요 바당 아니 또 고참벌 지알아야 아니 지 답변데 동네 관계관계 집에서 당국을 사야지거와 어디 떡고 못을 지아인스.
So this is the fake or pretend survey that we created, and you can see all of our questions.
다다 인딩아 속에다 단다그 지출에 대해체 특히 주말 지수여와 되게 인스턴트 델라야 지수 같은 것도 세네 델라 좋아 가르가르 당바티 통고도 왔어.
One of our most important questions is about our independent variable, whether the person meditated or not.
다다다 데나네 가지고 좋게 지시지 가르쳐고래 세나 나고 곰자 마제사 좀 곰자 마제사 티게 전부 자기 레스티 가지고 아니 디가사 투메긴 주치 테레스.
We also then ask questions about how long it took somebody to fall asleep or how long they slept.
팀다야 셴다 저카리트레스나 뉴크야라 냐누기질라 뉴크야라야 감마가서 좀 걸서사야다 아니 뉴 저널로 퀸스에 좋아대요 요레스.
We asked questions about whether people woke up at night or not.
다 셴다에 바나 찬다고 니세 소마송세 레트라야 주스.
And here is the question about whether you remember a dream from last night.
또 당고처럼 게 니 말람 당와테 땡기둠도 세 되게 좋아대 들려스.
For this question, I want to point out an important note from Ken, who talked with us yesterday.
단다게 좋아대 단데레 아니 갱 카이선 전다트니 갱 캔라게 아니 디콜라야 세시치나소 데 단다데 모트치인스 개침부치 세시나소.
So whether you remember dreaming in part is related to at what point you're sort of waking up at night or whether you're waking up at least a little bit.
다 지티 가르스나 가지고 말람 테마텐 치고로 말람 테마텐 세티 당고 아니리 세마세게 네탄타야나 지가 니게 네버 관계 지라야 지가 니리 세마세티 단데와요레스.
So you may not remember waking up, but your brain may get into that state of more awakeness where it can then sort of store that information about what happened in the dream.
동이스처럼 아니리 베트 세메바인바나 처럼 가 레파게로와 레파게야 지가 세백이 네버텔라치 딜레친데다 아니 되게 값이 좀 여기 차튼치거라 니스치거라 텔레피나텔레 녀소치야기 네탄테용 그랬어.
And pretty much everybody is dreaming, but it sort of depends on sort of this wake up state as to whether you remember it.
지금 만나 패치어가 말람다 다 당거요레스 당거요 빠르다 이나야 지가 저 아니리 세백이 네버 되게 랑신들라텐데다 아니 테마텐테용 그랬어.
So I changed this question from asking somebody, did you dream last night, to do you remember dreaming last night?
다단다 델라야 속에 가서 저한테 주라당 요로와 저한테 델라 당보대 저런 당과 말람 땅송에서 저한테 살아야 저런 당과 말람 땅바데 땡게도에서 저한테 땅요레스.
Because if I asked, did you dream last night? Ken and Robin and other neuroscientists would always answer that yes.
백케데 로 저한테 저런 당과 말람 땅송에서 계제티 치바이나 소아 아니 갱켄 당 로빈 타버기 원사 세르기 기겐 코소게 카티마나 말람 땅송세기 렌티 자그레스.
So finally, I'll point out that we also added a bunch of questions to our survey about sort of when somebody woke up, how they felt right at that moment.
Shanda yang also the current trajectory resistant by nearly separate cups and it's through kind of watching do say take some kind of watch reduce take a color and track mambuch trees.
So every time that the survey got filled out, or in pretend land got filled out, it then got stored, all that information got stored by Google.
That dealer what under the church we try the dollar land job we have seen, but learn job by banner take a land concert under Google from Dignatil Punya such a shares.
So when you look at your survey, once you start collecting data, you'll see the number of responses go up, and you can click on this to see them in a spreadsheet.
That other day of Sembana cook a link at Sujo, you made the response Katan Stang to a link at Sujo, make it uncutted to Stongaris, and they have such a day down to the remove Nalaya, Palani to not under Deganlaya, remove it on the oil to touch to a Degan name by Bana, and could do Spalaya, Tansagris.
And here are our data, so we can see who filled out the survey, which is important if we want to track them over time.
That under Degalana, Matsuge, Delaya, or the Cheship de Lanzushi, minted to Shayos, the day Trigono with Jensenkaris is Tambalaya, Machimaro, Nimani Sum such as Tambalaya, Michiki, Nimamando Mandola, Chiate, Kangikangi Lankangi Jesha said, how could I get to make mintil headers?
And we can also see in our fake data set, we have our samples from our first day, which is December 10th, and then the ones from the second day, December 11th. So what we'll do next, not tomorrow, because you have tomorrow off, but on Monday, we will start sort of going through and how you can take this information and then get averages, figure out proportions, and then we'll also start to do that with sort of larger data sets for those of you that are doing big surveys.
Sonic message, Miss Dawa Zam Capsanga Sukarichi and Senate and the Delight to la teach the Tantuch to a Tantu de Kideti, and the Tantu data Latin data, Chanum Katsu Chiresha, said on Teta Caneta to the Chiachua, Teta, Tanda Dilatanga Sulaya, Chitantu de Nonoradua, then I say Chetsuki Tantu, Shimjika Capsa Tantu Mambu the Richi Shachuara. Or data yanko land data is Canada Chichigure, data Canada Peshitango said is a Dawalangas nutrients.
So, but just to show you an example, I have copied the information on whether somebody did the meditation or not, and whether they remembered dreaming or not.
Tanda Dikalangas Kachi Senara, Hazotilaya, and a Kasa, Gomja imbe members at data. Ani malam tang ba tengi dum du sa ge ten shadus dig gan la ya muskachi to lensha yes.
And this data set is small enough that I could just count the numbers of yeses and nos for those that meditated and those that did not.
Tanda de ko tang to gi mu dinang la ha chen yon yo tang ro ani gom jabin tang ma je mesati ani tanga and
then if I move my head, you'll see that I can insert a chart if I pick these data, and I could present it this way, for example, which is counting the numbers of yeses and nos for the meditators.
Deka Sembanga Suga Katangatsu, Gonjaba, Gon Majabi, Katan to Stangores.
Or this is called a stack bar plot, where you can see that we have a lot more of those that meditated, remembering dreaming, than those that did not.
Tatanadi Bananga Suga, Nari Bakasha, Nariti Chikagala Chicha, and did them by Banadic of Sayanko. Gom Janita Majana, Malam Tamba the Tangadum to say, Nitandus Naritian Chigala Chitachi to so much years.
So what you will do on Monday morning is you are going to start to think about the data that you're collecting and what specific questions you want to ask.
다 제쪽에 자 나오고 쇼파티 지야 같이 그래서는 제쪽에 단다 당투 들을지게 여바테다 콜라야 삼르당데 단테단 저요 주게 아니 저와 믹스해봐 아니 가리치 당게 두근도 세티 콜라시스 삼르당고 요레스.
And these questions should be specific enough that you can easily identify the dependent variable that you have measured in your survey.
단다데 가슴바네 저한테 인침치다 니어드 카세보다 지가 믹스가와 된다 연구를 했다. 되게 믹스가가 이전센트가 그래서는 저한테 라텐데데 저런 거 딱시 지어다 지금 당투 들을지와 되게 나네 아니 맞고게 뒤지게 이제 transfer와 뒤지게 이제 transfer이 막 문진 투하지 지고 그랬어.
And you each have a copy of this presentation in your group folder, so you can actually add a bunch of questions here as a reminder for your group.
다 단다되게 로또 년르데 만에서 된친 소소소소게 지금 주세주어로 되게나마 예스 된담발 지수소소소소게 대표주 당대 되게나라야 저 가래가래 당게 배텐디가라야 내 가능지지 지나르고 예스.
And then here is asking you to go back to those questions and think about what kind of graph you might make. Do you think a pie chart would be good, or a histogram, or a scatter plot, for example?
다단다 되게 값이 되게나라에서 갔다 그랬으나 와 저한테 딱깔아 양치 삼르당 됐다 저한테 딱한 제비가 장도 됐다 아니 지금 천벌지야라야 아니 틀 가래가래 집에서 당게 비차샤나 고르티 배제 당게 야나 디리티 배제 당게 야나 토르티 배제 당게 인스카게 당게 배제 당게 임베세 되가라야 삼르당고 예스디 값이.
And then finally, sort of a key part of being a scientist is to be able to explain your results to others.
다 tsering 딱세바지 임베게 지가 지 자시 개침부로지 가르서는 저런 거 딱세 지샤주 되게 점되게 아니 지가 카스우강의 미젠나리아 대시자도 가지고 그랬어.
So we put a number of graphs in here so that somebody in the group can take turns sort of explaining what they think the meaning is of those results to the rest of the group.
다 단다들라야 가지고 들을 말씀을 들을때 만도 가시 지샤였어. 안 딘스담바시 주루카루카가 나네로와 아니 미치게 들되게 남동 가리지 청구도 세대 아니 루카게 난게 아니 처음에 현달도 못지나 되겠어. 가리가리 청구요메디 가서 오차지도.
So with that, I wish you all a good night, and I hope you enjoy your break tomorrow, and we will see you on Monday.
That's all. Only to start travaying. Any zunja any nangos any sani concert to shows. Any what's that? Dawa